Welcome to Sleepy Science Odyssey. Tonight, consciousness. The subjective experience of being aware, of having thoughts and feelings, of existing from a first-person perspective, from the neural correlates underlying awareness to the philosophical mysteries that have puzzled thinkers for millennia, from the stages of sleep and waking to altered states induced by meditation or anesthesia, from questions about animal consciousness to debates about machine awareness. We'll explore what science has discovered about the nature of conscious experience, how the brain generates subjective awareness, and why consciousness remains one of the deepest mysteries in all of science. If you're new here, this channel is for people who need something to think about before they can stop thinking. Real consciousness science, no exaggeration, just quiet facts in the dark. Let's begin. Consciousness refers to subjective experience, what it feels like to be you, perceiving and thinking from a first-person perspective. Defining consciousness precisely is notoriously difficult, as consciousness is the very thing we use to define and understand everything else, creating a circularity that has challenged philosophers and scientists for centuries. The most general definition describes consciousness as subjective experience, the phenomenal quality of awareness, what philosophers call qualia, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the taste of coffee, the feeling of sadness. Consciousness is what makes there be something it is like to be you, in philosopher Thomas Nagel's famous phrasing from his essay, "What is it like to be a bat?" If there is something it is like to be an organism, experiencing the world from its perspective, that organism is conscious. If there is nothing it is like to be something, if it is all darkness inside, no subjective experience occurring, it is not conscious. This definition immediately raises profound questions that have occupied philosophers for millennia, and that science is only beginning to address empirically. What physical processes give rise to consciousness? Is consciousness a fundamental property of the universe like mass and charge, or does it emerge from complex information processing in brains? Could artificial systems be conscious? Are animals conscious? And if so, which ones? How can we know whether something is conscious when we can only directly access our own subjective experience? These questions, collectively known as the hard problem of consciousness, distinguish consciousness research from other areas of neuroscience, where the challenges are merely technical rather than conceptual. The hard problem, articulated most clearly by philosopher David Chalmers, asks why and how physical processes in brains give rise to subjective experience. Science can in principle explain the easy problems: how brains process information, control behavior, respond to stimuli, store memories, generate language. These are tremendously complex challenges requiring decades or centuries of research, but they're problems that seem solvable through standard scientific methods of observation, experimentation, and theory building. The hard problem is different. Even if we completely understood all information processing in brains, we would still face the question of why these processes are accompanied by subjective experience. Why there is something it feels like to have these processes occurring rather than everything happening in the dark, without any accompanying experience. This explanatory gap between objective physical processes and subjective experience has led some philosophers to argue consciousness cannot be explained scientifically, that it requires new principles beyond physical laws, while others argue the hard problem is a confusion that will dissolve as we better understand brain function. And still others propose intermediate positions suggesting consciousness may require new concepts, but is still scientifically tractable. The debate continues, and consciousness research proceeds along multiple tracks, including neuroscience, identifying neural correlates of consciousness, brain activity patterns associated with conscious experience, cognitive science studying information processing architectures that may be necessary for consciousness, and philosophy examining conceptual foundations and logical structure of consciousness. Consciousness is often divided into different types or aspects to make the enormous topic more tractable. Phenomenal consciousness refers to subjective experience, the what-it-is-like aspect. Access consciousness refers to information being available for use in reasoning, reporting, and guiding behavior. These can dissociate. Information might be consciously accessed without phenomenal experience, as some argue occurs in blindsight, where cortically blind patients respond to visual stimuli they claim not to see. Or there might be phenomenal experience without access consciousness, as possibly occurs in early infant consciousness before cognitive systems develop. Self-consciousness adds awareness of oneself as a distinct entity with a past and future, typically assessed through mirror self-recognition tests, where organisms demonstrate recognition of mirror reflections as themselves rather than other individuals. States of consciousness refer to global levels of awareness and responsiveness, from deep sleep where consciousness is minimal or absent, through various sleep stages with different phenomenology, to normal waking consciousness, to altered states induced by meditation, psychedelics, or pathological conditions. Contents of consciousness refer to particular experiences at given moments, the specific thoughts, perceptions, emotions, and sensations occurring now. Understanding both states and contents and how they relate to brain activity comprises much of consciousness neuroscience's agenda. The stream of consciousness, William James's term for the continuous flow of experience, highlights consciousness's dynamic, ever-changing character. Experience is not a series of discrete snapshots, but a continuous flow with themes and variations, with contents constantly shifting as attention moves. Perceptions update, thoughts arise and dissolve, emotions fluctuate. This temporal structure raises questions about integration, how brain processes occurring at different times and in different regions are unified into coherent experiences, and about the relationship between neural time scales measured in milliseconds and experiential time scales that can expand or contract dramatically depending on conditions. Consciousness appears to have limited capacity, with attention selecting subset of available information for conscious processing, while other information is processed unconsciously or ignored. This selectivity manifested in phenomena like inattentional blindness, failing to notice unexpected objects when attention is engaged elsewhere, famously demonstrated by studies where people watching basketball games fail to notice a person in a gorilla suit walking through the scene. Change blindness shows failures to notice large changes to scenes when changes coincide with visual disruptions, revealing that conscious experience is far sparser than intuition suggests, with much visual detail not actually represented consciously, despite the subjective impression of complete awareness. The neural basis of consciousness, which brain regions and activity patterns are necessary and sufficient for conscious experience, has been investigated through multiple methods, including studying brain damage patients who lose specific aspects of consciousness, measuring brain activity during different conscious states using neuroimaging and electrophysiology, manipulating consciousness with anesthesia or brain stimulation, and comparing neural activity when stimuli are consciously perceived versus when identical stimuli are presented but not consciously perceived. These studies converge on several principles while leaving fundamental questions unresolved. Consciousness appears to require widespread cortical activity rather than being localized to specific regions, though some areas, including posterior cortical regions and specific thalamic nuclei, seem particularly important. The global workspace theory, proposed by Bernard Bars and developed by Stanislas Dehaene and colleagues, suggests consciousness arises when information becomes globally available to multiple cognitive systems through broadcasting across long-range connections linking frontal, parietal, and temporal cortices. Supporting evidence includes neuroimaging showing that consciously perceived stimuli evoke widespread, sustained cortical activation, while unconsciously processed stimuli evoke local, brief activation. Integrated information theory, developed by Giulio Tononi, proposes consciousness corresponds to integrated information, quantified as phi, a measure of how much information the system generates beyond the information its parts generate independently. High phi requires both differentiation. The system can be in many different states, and integration. The states cannot be reduced to independent parts. This theory makes the controversial prediction that any system with high integrated information is conscious regardless of substrate, potentially including non-biological systems or even simple simulated networks if appropriately structured, while also predicting that feed-forward networks like current AI systems have zero phi despite sophisticated behavior. Predictive processing frameworks suggest consciousness involves hierarchical generative models that predict sensory input, with conscious experience reflecting high-level predictions rather than raw sensory data. This explains why perception seems rich and complete despite sparse actual input. The brain fills in expected details through top-down predictions. Consciousness might particularly involve predictions that require updating, with surprising or unpredicted input breaking through to consciousness, while expected input is processed unconsciously. This framework connects consciousness to learning, attention, and action selection, providing a functional perspective on why consciousness evolved. The brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons connected by trillions of synapses that process information underlying conscious experience. The human brain, weighing approximately 1.4 kilograms and occupying about 1,300 cubic centimeters, contains roughly 86 billion neurons, nerve cells specialized for electrical signaling, connected through an estimated 100 trillion synapses, junctions where neurons communicate. This enormous cellular complexity, combined with diversity of neuron types, neurotransmitter systems, and connection patterns, creates information processing capabilities underlying all mental functions, including consciousness. Understanding how this biological substrate generates subjective experience represents one of science's greatest challenges. Neurons consist of cell bodies containing nuclei and metabolic machinery, dendrites, branching extensions receiving inputs from other neurons, and axons, long fibers transmitting outputs to other neurons, sometimes extending over a meter in length for neurons connecting brain to spinal cord. Neurons communicate through action potentials, electrical impulses propagating along axons when neurons become sufficiently depolarized, typically triggered when summed inputs from other neurons exceed threshold. Action potentials travel at speeds ranging from 1 meter per second in unmyelinated axons to over 100 meters per second in large myelinated axons, with myelin, fatty insulation produced by glial cells, dramatically increasing conduction velocity through saltatory conduction, where action potentials jump between gaps in myelin. When action potentials reach synapses, they trigger neurotransmitter release, molecules diffusing across synaptic clefts and binding to receptors on target neurons, causing electrical or biochemical changes. Different neurotransmitters and receptors create diverse effects. Glutamate generally excites neurons, increasing firing probability. GABA generally inhibits neurons, decreasing firing probability. Dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, and acetylcholine modulate neural activity in complex ways depending on receptor types and locations. This chemical signaling allows enormous flexibility in neural computation, with synaptic strengths. How much postsynaptic neurons respond to presynaptic activity, modifiable through experience, providing the substrate for learning and memory. The cerebral cortex, the brain's outer layer responsible for higher cognitive functions, contains approximately 16 billion neurons organized in layers with stereotyped circuits repeated across regions, but with regional specializations. Primary sensory cortices process basic features of vision, hearing, touch, with information flowing from subcortical structures through thalamus to primary cortices, then to association cortices that extract increasingly complex features and combine information across modalities. Motor cortices control movement through descending pathways to spinal cord and brainstem motor neurons. Prefrontal cortices support working memory, planning, decision-making, and executive control. Temporal cortices process high-level visual features and memory. Parietal cortices process spatial information and attention. Subcortical structures including thalamus, basal ganglia, hippocampus, amygdala, and brainstem nuclei perform crucial functions for consciousness and cognition. The thalamus acts as a relay and integrator, receiving input from sensory systems and subcortical structures and projecting to cortex, with reciprocal connections allowing bidirectional information flow. Damage to specific thalamic nuclei can impair consciousness, suggesting the thalamus plays essential roles beyond simple relay. The basal ganglia, consisting of striatum, globus pallidus, substantia nigra, and subthalamic nucleus, form loops with cortex that select actions, learn habits, and process rewards, with dysfunction causing movement disorders like Parkinson's disease and potentially contributing to consciousness disorders. The hippocampus, located in medial temporal lobes, is crucial for forming new declarative memories, memories for facts and events that can be consciously recalled. Damage to hippocampus causes anterograde amnesia, inability to form new memories, while leaving working memory and remote memories intact, demonstrating the hippocampus's specific role in memory consolidation. The famous patient Henry Molaison, known as HM, underwent bilateral hippocampal removal to treat epilepsy in 1953, and the resulting profound amnesia revealed the hippocampus's importance and inspired decades of memory research. HM could learn new motor skills and showed priming effects, demonstrating preserved unconscious memory despite impaired conscious memory. The amygdala, adjacent to hippocampus, processes emotions, particularly fear and threat detection. Amygdala damage impairs fear learning and recognition of fearful expressions while leaving many other functions intact. The amygdala receives sensory information through multiple pathways, including a fast subcortical route from thalamus, allowing rapid responses to potential threats before cortical processing provides detailed analysis, an architecture allowing better safe than sorry responses. The amygdala also modulates memory consolidation, with emotional events remembered better than neutral events partly through amygdala enhancement of hippocampal function. Brainstem nuclei including locus coeruleus producing norepinephrine, raphe nuclei producing serotonin, substantia nigra and ventral tegmental area producing dopamine, and basal forebrain producing acetylcholine send diffuse projections throughout brain, modulating neural activity and influencing arousal, attention, mood, and motivation. These neuromodulatory systems don't directly encode specific information, but adjust how other systems process information, comparable to turning up gain or changing filter settings. Different states of consciousness, waking, different sleep stages, anesthesia, are characterized by different patterns of neuromodulator activity, suggesting these systems regulate consciousness levels. Brain activity can be measured through multiple techniques, each with different strengths and limitations. Electroencephalography, EEG, measures electrical potentials at scalp from synchronized activity of thousands of neurons, providing excellent temporal resolution, measuring changes on millisecond timescales, but poor spatial resolution, unable to localize activity precisely to small regions. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, measures blood oxygen level dependent signals reflecting metabolic activity, providing good spatial resolution showing activity in regions of a few millimeters, but poor temporal resolution limited to seconds by slow hemodynamic responses. Magnetoencephalography, MEG, measures magnetic fields from neural activity, combining good temporal resolution with better spatial resolution than EEG. Electrocorticography, ECOG, measures directly from electrodes on brain surface, providing both excellent temporal and spatial resolution, but requiring invasive surgery, limiting use to clinical patients. Studies using these techniques during different conscious states reveal characteristic activity patterns. Waking consciousness shows desynchronized, high-frequency EEG rhythms reflecting diverse, independent neural activity across cortex. Deep sleep shows synchronized, slow oscillations reflecting widespread coherent activity. Anesthesia produces dose-dependent changes including initial increased fast activity, then slow-wave activity similar to sleep, then at deep levels burst suppression where activity alternates between bursts and complete silence. The transition from unconsciousness to consciousness during awakening or anesthesia emergence is not gradual, but shows rapid, nonlinear changes suggesting consciousness involves phase transitions between qualitatively different brain states rather than continuous variation. Neural oscillations, rhythmic fluctuations in activity, occur across multiple frequency bands with different functional roles. Delta oscillations, 1 to 4 Hz, dominate deep sleep. Theta oscillations, 4 to 8 Hz, occur during sleep, drowsiness, and memory tasks. Alpha oscillations, 8 to 13 Hz, occur during relaxed wakefulness, particularly with eyes closed. Beta oscillations, 13 to 30 Hz, occur during active thinking and attention. Gamma oscillations, 30 to 100 Hz or higher, occur during cognitive tasks, and have been proposed to bind features into unified perceptions through synchronization across regions processing different features. Whether specific oscillation frequencies are necessary for consciousness remains debated, but altered oscillatory patterns consistently accompany altered conscious states. Long-range connectivity between distant brain regions, measured through coherence of activity or strength of anatomical connections, appears crucial for consciousness. Disorders of consciousness, including vegetative state and minimally conscious state, show reduced long-range connectivity compared to conscious states, with connectivity measures correlating with consciousness level and sometimes predicting recovery. Theories like global workspace and integrated information emphasize widespread integration as a consciousness requirement, consistent with these findings. However, the specific patterns of connectivity supporting consciousness, and whether some connections are more important than others, remain active research questions. Sleep cycles through distinct stages each night, with different brain activity patterns and mental experiences. Sleep, occupying approximately 1/3 of human life, is not a uniform state, but cycles through several stages characterized by different brain activity, physiology, and mental content. Understanding sleep stages and their neural basis has revealed that even apparent unconsciousness during sleep involves complex brain activity and experiences, though different from waking consciousness. The discovery of REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, in 1953 revolutionized sleep research by revealing a sleep stage with paradoxical features combining cortical activation, similar to waking with profound muscle paralysis and vivid dreaming. Normal sleep architecture consists of cycling through stages roughly 90 to 110 minutes per cycle, with 4 to 6 cycles per night. Sleep onset involves transition from waking to stage 1 non-REM sleep, N1, characterized by theta activity and slow rolling eye movements lasting a few minutes. Stage 2, N2, shows theta activity plus sleep spindles, brief bursts of 12 to 16 Hz activity generated by thalamus and K-complexes, large slow waves possibly protecting sleep from disruption. N2 comprises approximately half of total sleep. Stage 3, N3, slow wave sleep or deep sleep, shows high-amplitude delta waves reflecting synchronized cortical activity, occurring primarily in first half of night. REM sleep shows desynchronized, fast activity resembling waking EEG, but with complete muscle atonia, except for respiratory muscles and eye muscles that produce the rapid eye movements giving REM its name. The first sleep cycle emphasizes non-REM, particularly slow-wave sleep, with minimal or no REM. Subsequent cycles include increasing REM duration, with final cycles containing mainly REM and light non-REM. This architecture suggests different functions for sleep stages, with slow-wave sleep hypothesized to support physical restoration and memory consolidation, while REM supports emotional processing and procedural memory. The specific functions remain debated, with multiple non-mutually exclusive hypotheses proposed. Mental experiences during sleep, assessed through awakening participants, and asking them to report what was in their mind immediately before awakening, vary systematically across stages. REM sleep produces vivid, hallucinatory, narrative dreams with complex plots, characters, and emotions, often bizarre and disconnected from reality, with dream logic accepting impossibilities as normal. Approximately 80 to 90% of REM awakenings yield dream reports. Non-REM sleep, particularly slow-wave sleep, was long thought to produce no experiences. but studies find that 50 to 70% of non-REM awakenings also yield reports, though these are typically briefer, less vivid, more thought-like than hallucinatory, and more realistic than REM dreams. The content differences may reflect different cognitive processing during stages rather than presence versus absence of consciousness. The neural basis of dreaming involves interactions between cortical and subcortical systems that differ from waking. During REM, cholinergic neurons in brainstem are highly active, while norepinephrine and serotonin neurons are silent, opposite the waking pattern, producing neurochemical conditions that may contribute to dream bizarreness and lack of rational thought. Visual cortex shows high activity during REM despite closed eyes and darkness, consistent with visual hallucinations in dreams. However, primary visual cortex may be less active than higher visual areas, suggesting dreams rely more on top-down generation of imagery than bottom-up sensory processing. Frontal cortex, particularly dorsolateral prefrontal cortex supporting executive functions and working memory, shows reduced activity during REM, potentially explaining reduced critical thinking in dreams and amnesia for most dreams upon awakening. The function of dreaming remains mysterious despite widespread speculation. Freud proposed dreams reveal unconscious wishes and conflicts, requiring interpretation to uncover hidden meanings, a view largely abandoned by contemporary neuroscience, but still influential in some psychoanalytic circles. Modern theories propose dreams serve memory consolidation, emotional regulation, threat simulation preparing for dangers, or are simply epiphenomena, meaningless byproducts of neural activity without adaptive function. Evidence supports roles for sleep in memory consolidation, with sleeping after learning improving memory compared to equivalent waking intervals, and with memory consolidation occurring more for information followed by sleep than waking. However, whether dreams themselves are necessary or whether non-conscious sleep processes are sufficient remains unclear. Lucid dreaming, awareness during dreams that one is dreaming, demonstrates consciousness, can persist during sleep with subjective experience, including meta-awareness. Lucid dreamers can signal from dreams using predetermined eye movements that are recorded on EEG, allowing objective verification of lucid states and communication from dreams. Lucid dreaming occurs most commonly during REM, though occasionally during non-REM, suggesting REM permits waking-like consciousness more readily than non-REM. Training can increase lucid dreaming frequency, and some individuals report frequent spontaneous lucid dreams. Lucid dreaming challenges the notion that sleep is unconscious, instead suggesting consciousness continues, but with altered qualities and reduced connection to external environment. Sleep deprivation profoundly impairs cognitive function and consciousness quality. After 24 hours without sleep, attention and reaction times degrade to levels equivalent to legal intoxication. After longer deprivation, microsleeps occur, brief lapses where brain activity transitions to sleep for seconds despite efforts to remain awake, creating dangerous situations during activities like driving. Performance becomes increasingly variable with brief periods of relatively preserved function alternating with severe impairment. Subjective experience becomes foggy, with reduced awareness of impairment. Sleep-deprived people often don't realize how impaired they are, similar to intoxication effects. Chronic partial sleep restriction, common in modern societies where many people sleep 6 hours or less nightly, produces cumulative deficits in cognitive function, mood, and health. Studies restricting sleep to 6 hours nightly show progressive impairment over days to weeks, with performance degrading to levels of total sleep deprivation after weeks of restriction. Concerningly, participants show reduced awareness of impairment, reporting they feel only mildly sleepy despite objective measurements showing severe deficits. This suggests chronic insufficient sleep creates new baseline perceived as normal despite substantial impairment, a troubling finding given widespread sleep restriction in modern life. The purpose of sleep remains incompletely understood despite sleep's universality across mammals and birds, and its occurrence in simpler forms in reptiles, fish, and invertebrates. That all animals spend substantial time vulnerable and inactive during sleep, despite risks from predators and lost opportunities for feeding and reproduction, suggests critical functions. Multiple hypotheses propose sleep supports energy conservation, brain cooling, synaptic homeostasis, downscaling synaptic strengths that increase during waking learning to prevent saturation, immune function, clearance of metabolic waste through increased flow of cerebrospinal fluid during sleep, and memory consolidation. Evidence supports roles for multiple functions, suggesting sleep serves several purposes rather than single function. The discovery that reduced sleep correlates with negative health outcomes, including cardiovascular disease, metabolic disorders, immune dysfunction, and reduced lifespan, has prompted public health efforts promoting adequate sleep. However, whether short sleep directly causes health problems or is correlated through shared factors like stress or disease remains debated. Experimental sleep restriction studies show acute negative effects on glucose metabolism, inflammation, and immune responses, suggesting causal links, but long-term experimental manipulation is impossible in humans for ethical reasons, limiting ability to establish causation definitively. Anesthesia reversibly eliminates consciousness through drug effects on brain function, though mechanisms remain incompletely understood. Anesthesia, the medically induced loss of consciousness, allowing surgery without pain or awareness, demonstrates that consciousness can be reversibly eliminated through pharmaceutical interventions affecting brain function. Despite anesthesia's routine use since the mid-19th century and its administration to millions of people annually, the mechanisms by which anesthetic drugs eliminate consciousness remain incompletely understood, with different anesthetics likely acting through different mechanisms while producing similar behavioral states. Understanding anesthesia may illuminate consciousness mechanisms by revealing necessary conditions for conscious experience. General anesthetics include diverse chemical classes with little structural similarity, including volatile gases like sevoflurane and disflurane, intravenous agents like propofol and ketamine, and dissociative anesthetics like nitrous oxide. Despite chemical diversity, most anesthetics at appropriate doses produce similar states including unconsciousness, amnesia, analgesia, reduced pain, and immobility. However, specific effects vary. Some anesthetics produce amnesia at doses lower than those causing unconsciousness, while others produce analgesia at subanesthetic doses. Ketamine produces dissociative states where patients may have eyes open and move, but report no awareness, illustrating that behavioral responsiveness doesn't necessarily indicate consciousness. Anesthetic mechanisms at molecular levels include enhancement of inhibitory neurotransmitter receptors, particularly GABAA receptors, that produce inhibition when activated, and inhibition of excitatory receptors, particularly NMDA glutamate receptors, that produce excitation when activated. By shifting the balance toward inhibition and away from excitation, anesthetics reduce overall brain activity and disrupt information processing. However, the critical question is not merely how anesthetics affect individual receptors, but how these molecular effects scale up to eliminate consciousness, which circuits and regions are critical, and what changes in network dynamics are necessary and sufficient for unconsciousness. Studies using EEG, fMRI, and other techniques during anesthesia reveal characteristic changes in brain activity. At low doses, many anesthetics produce increased beta and gamma frequency activity, possibly reflecting paradoxical excitation before inhibition dominates. At moderate doses producing unconsciousness, slow oscillations appear similar to those in deep sleep, with reduced high-frequency activity suggesting reduced information processing. At high doses, burst suppression occurs, alternating periods of activity and complete silence, indicating severe suppression approaching complete inactivation. During recovery, activity patterns reverse, with consciousness typically returning abruptly during a narrow dose range rather than gradually, suggesting critical transitions. Functional connectivity, correlations in activity between brain regions, decreases during anesthesia, particularly long-range connectivity between frontal and posterior cortices. This reduction parallels connectivity decreases in unconscious states, including sleep and coma, supporting theories emphasizing integration across distributed networks as necessary for consciousness. However, different anesthetics produce different connectivity patterns. Some reduce all connectivity globally, others selectively reduce specific connections, suggesting multiple routes to unconsciousness may exist rather than single critical connectivity pattern. The neural correlates of consciousness, brain activity patterns distinguishing conscious from unconscious states, have been investigated by comparing anesthetized and conscious states while holding sensory input constant. Studies presenting sounds during consciousness and anesthesia find that early sensory responses to sounds persist during anesthesia, indicating sensory processing continues, but later responses reflecting higher-level processing are absent or reduced. This suggests anesthesia doesn't prevent sensory information from reaching cortex, but prevents subsequent integration and processing that would normally accompany conscious perception. Awareness during anesthesia, patients regaining consciousness during surgery while paralyzed and unable to signal, occurs in approximately 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 10,000 procedures, traumatic experiences sometimes causing post-traumatic stress disorder. Risk factors include inadequate anesthetic dosing, equipment failure, increased anesthetic requirements in chronic substance users, and use of muscle relaxants preventing movement that would otherwise signal inadequate anesthesia. Monitoring techniques, including processed EEG measures like bispectral index, aim to assess anesthetic depth and reduce awareness risk, though effectiveness remains debated, with some studies showing benefit while others find no reduction in awareness rates. The subjective experience of anesthesia, reported by patients who regain consciousness briefly during surgery, varies from complete amnesia with no memories of any experience, to fragmented perceptions without comprehension of situation, to full awareness with comprehension and distress. Some patients report time seeming to pass instantaneously between losing and regaining consciousness, suggesting continuity of time may be disrupted even if brief conscious experiences occur. Others report dreamlike states or feelings of dread without specific perceptual content. The variability suggests consciousness during anesthesia is not all or none, but varies qualitatively and quantitatively. Emergence from anesthesia, the transition from unconscious to conscious state as drug levels decrease, provides opportunities to study consciousness recovery. Emergence typically occurs rapidly, with consciousness returning over minutes as drug concentrations cross critical thresholds. However, emergence is not simply reversal of anesthetic induction, but follows different trajectories, a phenomenon called neural inertia or hysteresis, where consciousness returns at different drug concentrations than those that eliminated consciousness. This suggests brain states during anesthesia may differ from initial states, requiring different conditions for consciousness recovery than for loss. Postoperative cognitive dysfunction, impaired memory, attention, and executive function persisting days to months after surgery, occurs in significant fractions of patients, particularly elderly individuals. While some dysfunction reflects surgical trauma, inflammation, and other factors unrelated to anesthetics, animal studies show anesthetic exposure can cause neuronal death, synaptic dysfunction, and altered development in young brains, raising concerns about pediatric anesthesia safety. Long-term consequences of repeated anesthetic exposure remain controversial, with human studies showing mixed results, some suggesting cognitive impacts, while others find no lasting effects after accounting for surgical indications and other confounds. Consciousness appears to exist on a continuum rather than being all or none, with intermediate states and partial awareness possible. Traditional views often treated consciousness as binary, either present or absent, but accumulating evidence suggests consciousness exists on continuums with multiple dimensions rather than single on-off switch. Levels of consciousness ranging from deep coma through vegetative state, minimally conscious state, and normal waking consciousness reflect quantitative differences in awareness and responsiveness. Contents of consciousness vary in richness, clarity, and organization, from sparse, fragmented experiences to rich, coherent awareness. Meta-awareness, awareness of awareness, varies from absent in normal experience to prominent in meditative states. These dimensions can vary independently, creating diverse conscious states. Disorders of consciousness resulting from severe brain injury illustrate graded consciousness levels. Coma, typically lasting days to weeks, involves complete unresponsiveness with eyes closed and no sleep-wake cycles. Vegetative state or unresponsive wakefulness syndrome involves sleep-wake cycles with eyes opening during wake periods, but no signs of awareness or purposeful behavior. Patients may show reflexive responses to pain, but not consistent command following or communication. Minimally conscious state involves inconsistent but reproducible signs of awareness, including command following, reaching for objects, or emotional responses appropriate to context. These states can be transient or persistent, with some patients recovering consciousness while others remain in altered states permanently. Distinguishing these states clinically is challenging because assessment relies on behavioral responses requiring not just consciousness, but also motor function, comprehension, and motivation, all potentially impaired independently. Studies using neuroimaging have revealed that some patients diagnosed vegetatively show preserved neural responses to commands invisible in behavior. Owen and colleagues in 2006 reported a vegetative patient who, when instructed to imagine playing tennis or navigating her house, showed appropriate brain activation in motor and spatial areas indistinguishable from healthy controls, suggesting preserved consciousness despite complete behavioral unresponsiveness. Subsequent studies found approximately 15 to 20% of vegetative patients show such covert command following, reclassifying them as consciously aware but unable to produce detectable behaviors. These findings have profound ethical and clinical implications for decisions about life support, pain management, and prognosis, and they highlight limitations of behavioral assessments for consciousness. They also raise philosophical questions about consciousness requirements. If consciousness can exist without any behavioral expression, what role does consciousness serve? Traditional theories linking consciousness to adaptive behavior seem challenged by covert awareness, suggesting consciousness may have intrinsic value or functions not requiring behavioral output, or that these cases represent unusual situations where brain damage has severed consciousness from behavioral systems that normally utilize conscious information. Locked-in syndrome, resulting from brainstem strokes that damage motor pathways while sparing cortex, produces complete paralysis except vertical eye movements, leaving patients fully conscious but unable to move or speak. With appropriate eye movement-based communication, locked-in patients can express themselves and report rich, normal conscious experiences despite profound motor impairment. This demonstrates consciousness can persist with minimal behavioral capacity, contrasting with vegetative state, where consciousness appears absent despite preserved movements like eye opening and reflexes. The neural bases distinguishing these states are being elucidated through neuroimaging. Vegetative state shows reduced metabolic activity in cortex to approximately 40 to 50% of normal levels, particularly affecting association cortices, while relatively sparing primary sensory and motor cortices. Functional connectivity is severely reduced, particularly in long-range connections. Minimally conscious state shows intermediate reductions, with metabolism and connectivity higher than vegetative but lower than normal. Crucially, preserved connectivity between frontal and parietal regions correlates with consciousness level, supporting theories emphasizing frontoparietal networks as consciousness substrates. Thalamus connectivity also correlates with consciousness, with greater thalamocortical connectivity predicting better outcomes. Prognostic indicators for consciousness recovery include clinical signs, command following, visual tracking, and oriented behaviors predict recovery, and neuroimaging measures. Preserved gray matter, maintained connectivity, and fMRI responses to commands predict recovery, while absence predicts poor outcomes. Time since injury matters, with recovery unlikely after months to years in vegetative state, though rare late recoveries have occurred, complicating prognostic certainty. Ethical guidelines generally support family decisions about continuing or withdrawing life support based on prognosis and patient values. But covert awareness discoveries raise questions about whether some patients currently considered vegetative might prefer continued support if they could communicate wishes. Partial consciousness or fragmented awareness may occur in various conditions. Split-brain patients who had corpus callosum severed to treat epilepsy show dissociations where each hemisphere processes information independently, raising questions about whether one or two conscious minds exist in one head. When objects are shown to the right visual field, processed by left hemisphere with language, patients can name them. When shown to left visual field, processed by right hemisphere without language, patients claim to see nothing, but can point to matching objects with left hand controlled by right hemisphere, suggesting non-linguistic awareness in right hemisphere that left hemisphere with speech doesn't access. Anesthesia awareness during paralysis, dissociative states from ketamine, certain psychedelic experiences, and some meditation states also suggest consciousness can fragment, with some aspects present while others are absent, or with metacognition disrupted such that experiences occur but aren't recognized as one's own or aren't remembered. These states challenge unitary conceptions of consciousness, suggesting it may be constructed from multiple components that can dissociate under unusual conditions. The binding problem in neuroscience asks how features processed in different brain regions are unified into coherent conscious experiences. When viewing a red square, color is processed in one region, shape in another, yet we experience a unified red square, not separate color and shape. Proposed solutions include synchronous neural activity binding features into unified representations, attentional mechanisms selecting and binding features, or hierarchical processing where higher areas integrate features. None is completely satisfactory, and binding remains a significant unsolved problem in consciousness neuroscience. Animal consciousness raises questions about the phylogenetic distribution and nature of subjective experience across species. Whether non-human animals are conscious, experiencing subjective awareness rather than being sophisticated unconscious automata, has been debated since antiquity, with Descartes famously arguing animals are unconscious machines, while most people intuitively believe at least some animals have experiences. The question is not whether animals process information or respond to environments, clearly they do, but whether there is something it is like to be an animal, whether subjective experience accompanies their information processing. This question has both scientific and ethical dimensions, as consciousness would make animals' welfare morally relevant in ways unconscious beings' welfare is not. Assessing animal consciousness faces fundamental methodological challenges, since we cannot directly access others' subjective experiences, and must infer consciousness from behavior, brain structure, and physiology. Criteria proposed for inferring consciousness include complex flexible behavior, learning and memory, responses to noxious stimuli, self-recognition, tool use, language-like communication, and neural structures similar to those correlated with consciousness in humans. However, which criteria are necessary or sufficient remains debated, with different theorists weighing evidence differently. Complex behavior and learning occur throughout the animal kingdom from insects to mammals, but behavioral complexity alone may not require consciousness. Sophisticated unconscious processing could potentially produce similar behaviors. However, flexibility, the ability to produce novel behaviors adapted to novel situations, may indicate consciousness if consciousness serves to flexibly integrate information for decision-making. Animals showing behavioral flexibility, including problem-solving, innovation, and learning complex tasks, are often considered strong consciousness candidates. Mammals and birds show clear evidence of complex cognition, flexible behavior, and emotional responses that most researchers interpret as indicating consciousness, though certainty is impossible. Great apes, elephants, dolphins, and corvids, crows, and relatives show particularly impressive cognitive abilities including tool use, social learning, planning for future, and apparent empathy. Mirror self-recognition, where animals recognize themselves in mirrors rather than treating reflections as other individuals, has been demonstrated in great apes, elephants, dolphins, and magpies, suggesting self-awareness. Though failures in mirror tests don't necessarily indicate lack of self-awareness, as alternative explanations exist, including lack of interest in mirrors or visual systems not suited for mirror recognition. Fish, long dismissed as simple stimulus response machines, show surprising complexity, including learning, long-term memory, social learning, tool use in some species, and pain responses suggesting subjective suffering. The claim that fish don't feel pain because they lack neocortex, the mammalian cortical structure associated with consciousness, is increasingly questioned as fish have pallium regions potentially homologous to cortex and show behavioral and physiological pain responses similar to mammals, including avoidance learning, protective responses, and altered behavior after analgesics. Whether fish consciousness is similar to mammalian consciousness or fundamentally different remains unknown, but evidence increasingly supports some form of awareness. Invertebrates including octopuses, cephalopods more generally, and possibly some insects and crustaceans show behaviors suggesting possible consciousness. Octopuses have large, complex nervous systems with approximately 500 million neurons, more than rats, distributed in brains and arms that can act semi-independently. They show learning, problem-solving, personality differences, playful behaviors, and responses to pain that change after analgesics. Their nervous systems evolved independently from vertebrates through convergent evolution, raising questions whether consciousness is one solution to processing challenges or whether radically different architectures can produce consciousness. If octopuses are conscious, it would demonstrate consciousness evolved at least twice, suggesting it may be common rather than rare. Insects with brains containing under 1 million neurons in fruit flies to several million in bees show impressive learning and flexibility, but whether this indicates consciousness is highly controversial. Arguments against insect consciousness emphasize small nervous systems lacking structures thought necessary for mammalian consciousness, while arguments for insect consciousness emphasize behavioral sophistication and note that consciousness requirements are unknown, so small size may not preclude consciousness if different architectures can be conscious. Recent discoveries of complex cognition in bees, including concept learning, counting, and cultural transmission of learned behaviors, have prompted some researchers to reconsider insect consciousness. Pain in animals is particularly ethically relevant, as presence of suffering would make many current practices morally problematic. Mammals clearly show behavioral, physiological, and neurological responses to noxious stimuli that parallel human pain responses, and analgesics reduce these responses, strongly suggesting subjective pain. Birds show similar responses. Fish, as mentioned, show responses that increasingly are interpreted as indicating pain, though debate continues. Invertebrates present greater uncertainty, with some showing protective responses and avoidance learning from noxious stimuli that could indicate pain or could reflect unconscious processes. The precautionary principle suggests treating animals as potentially conscious unless strong evidence indicates otherwise, given moral risks of causing suffering by incorrectly assuming unconsciousness. This principle has influenced animal welfare regulations in many jurisdictions, with legal protections extending to mammals and birds routinely, fish increasingly, and cephalopods in some places based on evidence for consciousness and pain. However, practical application remains inconsistent, with billions of animals treated as unconscious resources despite evidence suggesting awareness and suffering. Differences in consciousness between species likely exist even among clearly conscious animals, with human consciousness shaped by language, culture, and complex cognition in ways animal consciousness may not be. Whether these differences are quantitative, humans having more sophisticated but fundamentally similar consciousness, or qualitative, humans having fundamentally different kinds of consciousness, is debated. Thomas Nagel's essay, "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" emphasized that bat consciousness, relying on echolocation rather than vision, may be so different from human consciousness that we cannot imagine what it's like. Yet this doesn't mean bats lack consciousness, only that their consciousness is alien to us. Evolutionary perspectives suggest consciousness likely has gradual origins rather than appearing suddenly, implying intermediate forms between clearly conscious and clearly unconscious organisms. If this is correct, questions about where consciousness begins in phylogeny may lack clear answers, with consciousness emerging gradually through evolutionary time. Alternatively, if consciousness requires specific structures or integration mechanisms, it may have appeared relatively suddenly when those prerequisites evolved. Current evidence cannot distinguish these possibilities, leaving the distribution and nature of consciousness across species as open, fascinating, and ethically important questions. Attention selects information for conscious processing from the vast amount of information continuously available to sensory systems. Conscious experience, though subjectively complete and rich, is actually highly selective, representing only a small fraction of information available to sensory systems and brain processing. This selectivity is accomplished by attention, mechanisms that prioritize certain information for enhanced processing, while other information is processed minimally or ignored. Understanding attention is crucial for consciousness science because the relationship between attention and consciousness, whether they are identical, overlapping, or independent, has major theoretical implications. Attention can be divided into different types based on control and targets. Voluntary or endogenous attention is controlled by goals and intentions, directing processing to task-relevant information. Automatic or exogenous attention is captured by salient stimuli like sudden movements, loud sounds, or flashing lights, interrupting current processing. Spatial attention selects information from particular locations. Feature-based attention selects information with particular features like color or motion, regardless of location. Object-based attention selects all features of particular objects. These attention types interact in complex ways, with voluntary attention generally taking precedence, but exogenous attention interrupting when stimuli are sufficiently salient. Attention's effects on perception are dramatic. Attended stimuli appear brighter, faster, larger, and are detected more accurately and quickly than unattended stimuli. In crowded scenes, attention is required to perceive details, with unattended objects processed only crudely, their gist extracted but details lost. This selectivity creates phenomena like inattentional blindness, where unexpected objects are not consciously perceived when attention is engaged elsewhere, famously demonstrated in studies where people counting basketball passes fail to notice a person in a gorilla suit walking through the scene, and change blindness, where large changes to scenes go unnoticed when coinciding with visual disruptions like eye movements or brief occlusions. The neural basis of attention involves modulation of sensory cortex activity by control signals from frontal and parietal cortices. When attention shifts to a location, neurons with receptive fields at that location show enhanced responses to stimuli, with response increases of 20 to 50% or more for attended versus unattended stimuli. This enhancement reflects both amplification of responses to preferred stimuli and suppression of responses to non-preferred stimuli, improving signal-to-noise ratios. Attention also increases synchronization of neural activity and shifts activity to higher frequency bands, potentially facilitating communication between regions processing attended information. Frontal and parietal regions, including frontal eye fields, supplementary eye fields, intraparietal sulcus, and superior parietal lobule form networks controlling attention, with these regions showing activity preceding attention shifts, representing current attention targets, and modulating sensory processing through feedback connections. Damage to these regions impairs attention, with parietal damage causing spatial neglect where patients fail to attend to one side of space, typically the left side after right parietal damage, resulting in dramatic phenomena like eating food from only the right side of plates, drawing only right halves of objects, and denying that left limbs belong to them. These deficits demonstrate attention's necessity for normal conscious perception. The relationship between attention and consciousness is debated. Some theories equate attention and consciousness, arguing that attended information is conscious, while unattended information is unconscious. Evidence supporting this view includes findings that inattentional blindness prevents consciousness of unattended objects, and that attention modulates perceptual quality. However, other evidence suggests dissociations where information can be attended without consciousness or conscious without attention. Inattentional blindness failures show that sometimes conspicuous, attended objects are missed, suggesting attention doesn't guarantee consciousness. Peripheral vision and visual short-term memory may contain conscious information without focal attention. Some argue these apparent dissociations reflect difficulties defining and measuring attention and consciousness independently, while others argue they demonstrate genuine independence. Global workspace theory proposes consciousness occurs when information is broadcast to widespread cortical networks, making it globally available for multiple systems, with attention serving as gatekeeper, selecting what enters the global workspace. Under this view, attention and consciousness are related but distinct, with attention modulating access to consciousness, but not being identical to consciousness. Supporting evidence includes findings that attended information shows widespread cortical activation, while unattended information shows only local activation, and that reportable conscious percepts require global activation, while subliminal percepts produce only local activation. Attention capacity is limited, with performance degrading when multiple tasks or locations must be attended simultaneously. Classic demonstrations include dichotic listening, where people attend to speech in one ear while ignoring speech in the other ear, with ability to report attended speech, but very limited awareness of unattended speech. Dual task interference shows that performing two demanding tasks simultaneously impairs both, with impairment increasing as tasks become more similar or demanding. These limits may reflect competition for limited neural resources or processing bottlenecks that can handle only limited information simultaneously. The attentional blink demonstrates temporal limits where detecting a target impairs detecting a second target presented within 200 to 500 milliseconds, as if attention blinks during that interval. Competing theories explain this as resource depletion, processing bottleneck, or inhibitory interference. Regardless of mechanism, the phenomenon illustrates attention's temporal dynamics and provides paradigm for studying consciousness, since consciously perceived targets produce blinks while unconsciously processed targets don't. Attention training through meditation and other practices can improve attention control, expanding capacity and reducing susceptibility to distraction. Studies show that long-term meditators have reduced attentional blink, suggesting increased processing capacity or efficiency. Brain imaging shows meditation alters attention network structure and function, with increased gray matter in prefrontal and parietal regions, altered functional connectivity, and enhanced control signals. Whether these changes reflect neuroplasticity from extensive practice or pre-existing differences in people who become long-term meditators remains unclear, requiring longitudinal studies that follow people before and after meditation training. Altered states of consciousness induced by meditation, psychedelics, or other means reveal consciousness plasticity and varieties. Normal waking consciousness represents only one possible state among many that humans can experience. Altered states of consciousness, states differing significantly from ordinary waking experience in quality and character, can be induced through various means including meditation, psychedelics, sensory deprivation, rhythmic stimulation, extreme physical exertion, and pathological conditions. Studying these states reveals consciousness's plasticity and provides windows into mechanisms normally obscured in ordinary consciousness. Meditation practices cultivate specific mental states through training attention, awareness, and emotional regulation. Different practices produce different states, with focused attention meditation cultivating sustained focus on single objects like breath, open monitoring meditation cultivating broad awareness without fixation, and loving-kindness meditation cultivating specific emotional states. Advanced practitioners report states qualitatively different from ordinary consciousness, including absorption states, where sense of self and time dissolve, expansive awareness encompassing vast mental content without distraction, and states of equanimity where strong emotions are felt without reactivity. Neuroscience studies of meditation find diverse brain changes depending on practice. Focused attention increases activity in attention networks and decreases default network activity associated with mind wandering. Open monitoring produces different patterns, with reduced sensory cortex activity possibly reflecting reduced conceptual processing and more direct awareness. Long-term practitioners show structural brain changes including increased gray matter in prefrontal cortex and insula, reduced amygdala volume correlating with reduced stress reactivity, and altered connectivity within and between networks. Functional changes include enhanced attention, reduced mind wandering, reduced emotional reactivity, and altered sense of self. Flow states during intense engagement in challenging activities share features with meditation, including reduced self-awareness, distorted time sense, and enhanced performance. Athletes, musicians, and others report flow as highly positive yet different from ordinary consciousness. Neuroscience suggests flow involves reduced prefrontal cortex activity, transient hypofrontality, possibly reducing cognitive control and self-monitoring, while allowing automatic expert performance to proceed unimpeded. This account remains somewhat speculative given difficulties studying flow in laboratories, but it suggests optimal performance may require reducing certain consciousness aspects. Psychedelic substances including LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, and DMT produce profound alterations in perception, thought, emotion, and sense of self, with experiences ranging from euphoric to terrifying, meaningful to meaningless. Common features include visual hallucinations, synesthesia, blending of senses where sounds produce colors or music produces tactile sensations, dissolution of self-boundaries, altered time perception, and increased emotional intensity. The content varies enormously depending on substance, dose, setting, expectations, and individual differences, with same drug sometimes producing radically different experiences in different contexts. Neuroscience reveals that psychedelics primarily affect serotonin receptors, particularly 5-HT2A receptors expressed throughout cortex. LSD and psilocybin activate these receptors, producing increased cortical excitability and altered communication between regions. Neuroimaging shows decreased activity in default network regions associated with self-referential processing, potentially explaining ego dissolution. Increased communication between normally segregated networks, reduced hierarchical organization, and increased entropy or disorder in brain signals may underlie cognitive and perceptual changes. Some proposed psychedelics reduce top-down constraints from high-level models, allowing bottom-up sensory signals to influence perception more than normally, producing hallucinations and altered interpretations. Mystical experiences, profound states of unity, sacredness, transcendence, and noetic quality that something deeply true has been revealed, can occur spontaneously or be induced by various means including meditation, psychedelics, religious practices, and sometimes pathological states like temporal lobe seizures. The phenomenology is remarkably consistent across cultures and induction methods, suggesting common neural mechanisms. Psychedelic studies have induced mystical experiences in controlled settings, finding that the experience intensity correlates with long-term positive outcomes, including reduced anxiety in terminal illness, reduced addiction, and sustained well-being increases. However, mystical experiences can also be frightening or distressing, particularly if occurring in unsafe settings or in vulnerable individuals. Near-death experiences, vivid experiences sometimes reported by people who were close to death, resuscitated from cardiac arrest, or in other life-threatening situations, include common elements like traveling through tunnels toward lights, encountering deceased relatives, life reviews, feelings of peace and transcendence, and out-of-body experiences viewing one's body from external perspective. Whether these occur during unconsciousness or during loss and recovery of consciousness is debated, with some arguing they're retrospective confabulations rather than experiences during unconsciousness. Neuroscience proposes they may result from hypoxia, endorphin release, temporal lobe dysfunction, or REM intrusion into waking, though conclusive evidence is lacking. Out-of-body experiences, feelings of being located outside one's physical body, viewing oneself from external perspective, occur not only in near-death contexts, but also during sleep paralysis, meditation, psychedelics, and sometimes spontaneously. Neurological studies suggest they result from disrupted integration of multisensory body representations in temporoparietal junction, with conflicting signals from different sensory modalities, causing sense of body location to dissociate from physical body. Virtual reality and vestibular stimulation can induce out-of-body-like experiences, supporting the multisensory integration account. Synesthesia, where stimulation of one sense produces experiences in another, like seeing colors when hearing sounds or tasting shapes, occurs in approximately 4% of people developmentally, persisting across lifespan, and can also be induced temporarily by psychedelics. Grapheme color synesthesia, where letters and numbers evoke specific colors, is most common, but many variants exist. Neuroscience suggests synesthesia results from cross-wiring between sensory regions or reduced inhibition between normally segregated pathways, allowing activation to spread between modalities. Synesthetes show structural and functional differences in relevant brain regions supporting cross-activation accounts. These diverse altered states demonstrate consciousness is not fixed but highly plastic, modifiable through internal and external means. This plasticity raises questions about what aspects of consciousness are essential versus contingent. If consciousness can exist with radically altered contents, structures, and self-experiences, what defines consciousness? The common thread may be subjectivity. There remains something it is like to experience these states even when contents are radically unusual. Suggesting phenomenal character is consciousness's essential feature, while specific contents and structures are variable. The development of consciousness from infancy through childhood involves gradual emergence of self-awareness and metacognition. Human consciousness is not present in adult form at birth, but develops gradually throughout infancy and childhood as the brain matures and cognitive capacities emerge. Understanding consciousness development provides insights into its nature and requirements, revealing which aspects are innate versus learned, and how neural maturation supports conscious experience. However, studying infant consciousness is challenging because infants cannot report their experiences, requiring researchers to infer consciousness from behavior and brain activity. Newborn infants show basic sensory awareness, responding to sights, sounds, touches, smells, and tastes, suggesting some form of conscious perception is present from birth or shortly after. However, the quality of infant experience likely differs from adult experience, possibly lacking the integrated, self-aware character of mature consciousness. Infants show preferences for faces, responding more to face-like patterns than scrambled features, suggesting innate or very rapidly learned recognition of socially important stimuli. They also show habituation, reduced responding to repeated stimuli, indicating memory formation and ability to distinguish novel from familiar. The emergence of self-awareness occurs gradually through infancy and early childhood. Newborns lack clear signs of self-awareness. They don't distinguish self from environment or recognize themselves as agents of their actions. By 3 to 4 months, infants show contingency detection, recognizing that their movements control visual feedback, suggesting emerging awareness of agency. By 9 to 12 months, infants show social referencing, looking to caregivers for cues about how to respond to ambiguous situations, suggesting awareness of others as having knowledge about the world. Mirror self-recognition, a classic test of self-awareness, emerges around 18 to 24 months in humans. In the mark test, a spot of rouge is placed on an infant's forehead, and the infant is shown their reflection. Before 18 months, infants typically don't touch their own foreheads, suggesting they don't recognize the reflection as themselves. After 18 months, increasing numbers of infants touch their foreheads, indicating they recognize the reflection shows themselves. This is interpreted as evidence of self-concept, mental representation of oneself as an entity with properties. However, mirror self-recognition doesn't necessarily indicate all aspects of self-awareness are present. Only that recognition of visual appearance as one's own has developed. Theory of mind, understanding that others have mental states including beliefs, desires, and intentions that differ from one's own, develops around 4 to 5 years. Before this age, children show egocentric reasoning, assuming others know what they know and want what they want. The false belief task demonstrates theory of mind development. Children watch a character place an object in location A, then the character leaves, and the object is moved to location B. When asked where the character will look for the object, younger children say location B, where it actually is, while older children say location A, where the character believes it is. This shows older children understand others can have false beliefs differing from reality and from the child's own knowledge. The development of episodic memory, memory for personal experiences with awareness of self as experiencer, occurs gradually through early childhood. Very young children form memories but may lack autobiographical quality, the sense that I experienced this event. The earliest memories most adults can recall date from around 3 to 4 years old, a phenomenon called childhood amnesia. Before this age, few memories persist into adulthood despite evidence that young children do form memories that are accessible during childhood. The mechanisms underlying childhood amnesia are debated, with hypotheses including immature hippocampal development, lack of linguistic scaffolding for memory encoding, rapid changes in self-concept disrupting memory continuity, and high rates of neurogenesis in young hippocampus interfering with memory consolidation. Metacognition, awareness of one's own mental states and processes, also develops gradually. Young children are poor at monitoring their own knowledge, often overestimating what they know and failing to recognize when they don't understand something. With age, metacognitive monitoring improves, allowing better learning strategies including seeking clarification, allocating study time to difficult material, and checking comprehension. Neural correlates of metacognition involve prefrontal cortex, which undergoes protracted development extending into adolescence and early adulthood. Executive functions, cognitive control processes including working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility, develop throughout childhood and adolescence, supported by prefrontal cortex maturation. Young children show limited ability to inhibit prepotent responses, maintain information in working memory, or flexibly switch between task rules. These abilities improve gradually, with major developments occurring around ages 3 to 5 and continuing into adolescence. Executive function development likely supports consciousness development by enabling more complex, controlled processing that characterizes mature consciousness. Neural development underlying consciousness development involves multiple processes. At birth, most neurons are present, but synaptic connections are immature. During infancy and childhood, synaptogenesis, formation of new synapses, proceeds rapidly, with synaptic density peaking in cortex during early childhood at levels exceeding adult density. This is followed by synaptic pruning, where unused connections are eliminated, continuing through adolescence. Myelination, insulation of axons to speed conduction, also occurs gradually, with some pathways not fully myelinated until early adulthood. These structural changes support increasingly efficient, integrated processing underlying mature consciousness. Brain imaging studies show that infant brain activity differs from adults in several ways. Infants show less coordinated activity between distant regions, suggesting reduced integration. Neural oscillations differ, with reduced gamma activity possibly reflecting immature local circuits. Responses to sensory stimuli are slower and less specific, suggesting immature sensory processing. As development proceeds, brain activity becomes more adult-like with increased long-range connectivity, more robust oscillations, and faster, more specific sensory responses. The question of what infant consciousness is like, what it feels like to be an infant, is fundamentally unanswerable because we cannot remember early experiences and infants cannot report them. Philosopher William James famously described infant experience as a blooming, buzzing confusion, suggesting overwhelming sensory input without organization. However, this may underestimate infant capacities, as research shows infants can organize perceptions, form expectations, and learn rapidly, suggesting some coherence to their experience. Psychologist Alison Gopnik proposes that infant consciousness may be less focused and controlled than adult consciousness, but more broadly aware, with attention more diffusely distributed rather than narrowly focused, creating different but not necessarily less conscious experiences. Brain damage and neurological disorders reveal the fragility and modularity of conscious experience. Neurological damage from strokes, trauma, neurodegenerative diseases, and other causes can selectively impair specific aspects of consciousness while sparing others, revealing that consciousness is not unitary but comprises multiple components that can be dissociated. These dissociations provide crucial evidence about consciousness's neural basis and functional organization, showing which brain regions support which aspects of experience. Visual agnosias, deficits in visual recognition despite intact basic vision, demonstrate that conscious visual perception involves multiple stages that can be selectively disrupted. Apperceptive agnosia impairs recognition of object shapes, with patients unable to distinguish simple shapes or copy drawings despite seeing clearly. Associative agnosia impairs linking shapes to meanings, with patients able to copy drawings accurately but unable to identify objects, indicating intact shape processing but impaired access to semantic knowledge. Prosopagnosia specifically impairs face recognition, with patients unable to recognize familiar faces, including family members, though they may recognize individuals from voices or other cues. These selective deficits show that visual consciousness involves specialized processing streams that can fail independently. Blindsight, occurring after damage to primary visual cortex, involves ability to respond to visual stimuli in blind fields while denying conscious vision. Patients report seeing nothing in affected regions, but when forced to guess about stimulus properties, location, color, motion, perform better than chance, indicating unconscious visual processing. The phenomenon demonstrates dissociation between conscious vision and unconscious visual abilities, supporting theories distinguishing phenomenal consciousness from access consciousness. However, some patients may have residual awareness they don't recognize or report, complicating interpretations. Hemispatial neglect, typically following right parietal damage, causes patients to ignore left side of space despite intact sensation. Patients don't attend to left sides of objects, don't eat food from left sides of plates, don't groom left sides of bodies, and when asked to draw objects from memory, draw only right halves. The deficit isn't sensory. Patients can detect stimuli on the left when attention is directed there, but rather attentional, with attention automatically biased rightward. Neglect demonstrates attention's crucial role in conscious awareness, showing that stimuli can reach sensory cortex without entering consciousness if attention isn't allocated. Anesthesia, unawareness of deficits, occurs in various neurological conditions, with patients denying obvious impairments. After right hemisphere strokes causing left paralysis, some patients deny their left arms are paralyzed, insisting they're moving them or offering implausible explanations for why they're not moving. When confronted with evidence, patients may acknowledge problems momentarily but quickly forget and return to denial. Anesthesia for blindness, Anton's syndrome, involves blind patients insisting they can see, confabulating explanations for failures on vision tests. These conditions show that awareness of one's own states is distinct from the states themselves, requiring intact monitoring systems that can be selectively damaged. Alien hand syndrome, following damage to corpus callosum or supplementary motor areas, involves one hand acting independently of conscious control, performing actions the patient doesn't intend. The alien hand may interfere with the other hand's actions, unbuttoning shirt as the other hand buttons it, or reaching for objects the patient doesn't want. Patients report feeling the hand isn't theirs or isn't under their control despite recognizing it's physically attached. This shows that sense of agency, feeling of controlling one's actions, is distinct from motor control itself, depending on intact monitoring, comparing intended and actual actions. Capgras delusion, typically following combined damage to face recognition and emotional processing systems, involves belief that familiar people have been replaced by imposters. Patients recognize faces as looking like family members, but insist they're imposters because the emotional response normally evoked by familiar faces is absent. This shows that conscious recognition involves both cognitive identification and emotional resonance, with their dissociation creating striking delusions. Similar delusions occur for places, Fregali delusion, or objects, showing the importance of emotional responses in normal conscious experience. Alzheimer's disease progressively impairs conscious experience through widespread neural degeneration. Early stages primarily affect memory, particularly episodic memory for recent events, leaving older memories and other cognitive functions relatively intact. As disease progresses, additional impairments emerge, including language problems, executive dysfunction, and eventually personality changes and behavioral disturbances. In late stages, patients may not recognize family members, lose awareness of time and place, and show reduced responsiveness, suggesting reduced consciousness level. The progressive trajectory shows how consciousness depends on intact neural systems, degrading as those systems fail. Parkinson's disease primarily affects movement through degeneration of dopamine-producing neurons in substantia nigra, but also affects consciousness in complex ways. Many patients develop cognitive impairment and dementia, particularly in executive functions and visuospatial abilities. Some experience hallucinations, typically visual hallucinations of people or animals that patients may recognize as unreal. Dopamine medications used to treat motor symptoms can worsen hallucinations, creating treatment dilemmas. These effects show that dopamine systems influence not only movement, but also consciousness content and quality. Epilepsy involves abnormal synchronized neural activity that can alter consciousness dramatically. Generalized seizures cause loss of consciousness, with patients unresponsive during seizures and amnesiac for the episode. Absent seizures, brief lapses of consciousness lasting seconds, involve staring spells where patients are unresponsive but don't fall, with immediate return to normal consciousness and amnesia for the episode. Temporal lobe seizures can produce altered consciousness with preserved responsiveness but altered awareness, sometimes including intense déjà vu, fear, or mystical experiences. Post-seizure confusion, postictal state, involves reduced consciousness level with disorientation and confusion lasting minutes to hours. Brain death, irreversible cessation of all brain function including brainstem, results in permanent unconsciousness. Brain-dead patients show no responses to stimuli, no spontaneous movements, no brainstem reflexes, and no EEG activity, and they cannot breathe without mechanical ventilation. Brain death is legally recognized as death in most jurisdictions, allowing organ donation with consent. The contrast with vegetative state, where cortex is non-functional but brainstem maintains breathing and sleep-wake cycles, illustrates different levels of neural function, supporting different aspects of life and consciousness. Philosophical theories of consciousness attempt to explain the relationship between mind and matter. Beyond empirical investigations, consciousness raises profound philosophical questions about its place in nature and relationship to physical processes. Various philosophical theories attempt to explain how consciousness relates to brain activity, whether consciousness could exist in non-biological systems, and whether subjective experience can be fully explained by objective science. These theories guide research by suggesting which questions are most important and which approaches are most promising. Dualism, historically influential through Descartes' formulation, holds that mind and matter are fundamentally different substances, with consciousness belonging to immaterial mental substance, while brains belong to physical substance. This view explains why consciousness seems so different from physical processes, but faces serious problems, including how immaterial mind could interact with physical brain, how mental causation could occur if mind is non-physical, and lack of evidence for non-physical substances. Most contemporary philosophers and neuroscientists reject dualism as incompatible with scientific evidence, showing tight dependencies between brain states and mental states. Physicalism or materialism holds that everything is physical, with consciousness being physical processes in brains or arising from them. Most neuroscientists implicitly assume physicalism, seeking neural correlates of consciousness and expecting consciousness to be explained eventually in physical terms. However, explaining how physical processes give rise to subjective experience, solving the hard problem, remains challenging. Different versions of physicalism propose different relationships between consciousness and brain processes. Identity theory holds that conscious states are identical to brain states, with mental states being nothing over and above particular patterns of neural activity. This view explains mind-brain correlations as identity relations, with no mystery about how they're connected because they're the same thing described differently. However, critics argue conscious states and brain states have different properties. Brain states have locations, masses, electrical properties, while conscious states have phenomenal qualities, intentionality, subjective perspectives, making identity problematic. Functionalism holds that mental states are defined by their functional roles. their causal relations to inputs, outputs, and other mental states, rather than their physical implementation. Just as computer programs can run on different hardware, consciousness might be realizable in different physical substrates. This view allows that artificial systems could be conscious if they implement appropriate functions, making consciousness substrate independent. However, critics including philosopher John Searle argue that implementing functions isn't sufficient for consciousness, with Searle's Chinese room argument claiming that syntactic manipulation of symbols doesn't create semantic understanding or consciousness. Eliminativism holds that consciousness, as commonly conceived, doesn't exist, arguing that folk psychological concepts of mind will be replaced by neuroscientific concepts as understanding advances. Eliminativists claim that qualia, subjective experience, and other aspects of consciousness are illusions or misconceptions that will be eliminated from mature science. Most philosophers reject eliminativism as denying the most obvious facts of experience, with critics arguing that even if we're mistaken about consciousness's nature, we can't be mistaken that consciousness exists because its existence is given directly in experience. Panpsychism holds that consciousness is a fundamental feature of matter, with all physical entities having some form of experience, however simple. Complex consciousness in humans and animals emerges from combinations of simpler conscious entities. This view avoids the problem of explaining how consciousness emerges from non-conscious matter by denying that matter is fundamentally non-conscious. Integrated information theory has been interpreted as supporting panpsychism by suggesting any system with integrated information has consciousness. Critics argue panpsychism lacks evidence, faces the combination problem, how simple conscious entities combine into unified complex consciousness, and conflicts with scientific understanding. Emergentism holds that consciousness emerges from complex physical systems without being reducible to their components, analogous to how liquidity emerges from water molecules. Emergence can be weak, merely meaning consciousness is complex and difficult to predict from components, or strong, meaning consciousness involves genuinely new properties not present in components. Weak emergence is compatible with physicalism, while strong emergence suggests consciousness might involve new physical laws operating at neural scales. The concept of emergence is philosophically controversial, with debates about whether it explains anything or merely names the mystery. Higher-order theories propose that consciousness requires mental representations of mental states, with consciousness consisting in awareness of first-order states. A visual experience is conscious only if there's a thought about having that experience. This explains why consciousness involves subjectivity, awareness of states from first-person perspective, and distinguishes conscious from unconscious processing. Critics argue higher-order theories require potentially infinite regress of higher-order thoughts, face empirical problems from data on infants and animals who may lack higher-order thoughts but seem conscious, and may conflate consciousness with metacognition. First-order theories propose that consciousness doesn't require higher-order thoughts, but emerges directly from appropriate first-order representations. These theories emphasize that phenomenal consciousness, subjective experience, is distinct from access consciousness and doesn't require reportability or self-awareness. What makes experiences conscious is their intrinsic phenomenal character rather than being objects of thought. This view aligns with attributing consciousness to infants and animals who may lack higher-order thoughts but have rich sensory experiences. Artificial intelligence and machine consciousness raise questions about whether non-biological systems can have subjective experiences. As artificial intelligence systems become increasingly sophisticated, questions arise about whether they might be or become conscious. Could machines have subjective experiences? If so, how would we know? And what ethical implications would follow? These questions blend empirical, philosophical, and ethical considerations, with profound implications for how we design and treat AI systems. Current AI systems, despite impressive capabilities in specific domains, show no clear evidence of consciousness. They process information, recognize patterns, generate language, and make decisions. But these functions may occur without subjective experience, analogous to philosophical zombies, hypothetical beings behaviorally identical to conscious beings, but lacking inner experience. The key question is whether implementing appropriate information processing is sufficient for consciousness, or whether consciousness requires specific physical substrates like biological neurons. Functionalist theories suggest that consciousness depends on functional organization rather than physical substrate, implying that artificial systems implementing appropriate functions could be conscious. If consciousness arises from particular information processing architectures rather than specific physical implementations, then computers running appropriate programs might be conscious. Integrated information theory explicitly allows for machine consciousness, calculating that systems with high integrated information would be conscious regardless of whether they're biological or artificial. However, current AI architectures seem unlikely to support consciousness based on criteria suggested by various theories. Most AI systems use feed-forward networks where information flows one direction from input to output without the recurrent processing and integration that theories like global workspace and integrated information propose as necessary for consciousness. Recurrent neural networks have feedback connections allowing cyclical processing, potentially supporting integration. But whether current implementations achieve sufficient integration remains debatable. The Chinese room argument, proposed by John Searle, argues that implementing programs isn't sufficient for understanding or consciousness. The argument imagines a person in a room following instructions to manipulate Chinese symbols, producing appropriate responses to Chinese questions without understanding Chinese. Similarly, Searle argues, computers manipulate symbols without understanding meanings, so programming can't create consciousness. Critics argue the thought experiment is misleading because the system as a whole, person plus instructions, might understand even if the person alone doesn't, analogous to how no individual neuron understands, but brains do. Testing machine consciousness faces the other mind's problem in extreme form. With humans and animals, we infer consciousness from behavioral and neural similarities to ourselves, using analogical reasoning that becomes weaker as similarities decrease. With artificial systems structurally different from brains, analogical reasoning breaks down. We might require machines to report experiences, but reports could be generated without consciousness, and inability to report doesn't prove absence of consciousness. Behavioral tests like Turing tests assess indistinguishability from humans, but don't necessarily test consciousness. Systems might pass behavioral tests while being unconscious zombies or fail while being conscious, but differently from humans. Neural criteria face similar problems. We might look for neural correlates of consciousness, like widespread integration or specific oscillation patterns in artificial systems, but whether these criteria apply to non-biological substrates is unclear. Even if artificial systems show patterns similar to brain patterns correlated with consciousness, this doesn't prove the patterns cause consciousness or that similar patterns in different substrates produce consciousness. The substrate dependence question, whether consciousness depends on specific physical properties of neurons, remains unresolved. Ethical implications of machine consciousness would be profound. If machines can be conscious, they might have moral status requiring us to consider their well-being, avoid causing suffering, and respect their interests. Creating conscious machines might be morally problematic if their experiences were negative, analogous to concerns about creating animals to suffer. Shutting down conscious machines might constitute killing. These implications suggest we should be cautious about creating potentially conscious machines without understanding consciousness better and without consensus on machine moral status. Some argue we should adopt precautionary principles, treating advanced AI systems as potentially conscious unless proven otherwise, given moral risks of creating and mistreating conscious beings. Others argue this is premature, as evidence for machine consciousness is lacking and treating current AI as conscious would be anthropomorphism. Finding appropriate balance between recognizing potential machine consciousness and avoiding anthropomorphic attribution remains challenging. Future AI development might intentionally aim to create conscious machines, viewing consciousness as necessary for general intelligence or as intrinsically valuable. Alternatively, developers might aim to avoid consciousness, creating sophisticated unconscious systems to avoid ethical complications. Understanding consciousness requirements, which architectures, processes, and substrates are necessary and sufficient, is crucial for either goal, motivating consciousness research with practical applications beyond scientific curiosity. The possibility of machine consciousness also raises questions about consciousness diversity. If machines can be conscious, their consciousness might differ dramatically from biological consciousness, being based on different physical substrates, operating at different timescales, and having different sensory modalities and cognitive architectures. This would expand consciousness space, the range of possible conscious experiences, beyond biological forms, raising questions about whether fundamentally different forms of consciousness share common features or whether consciousness is radically diverse. If you're still awake somewhere in this exploration of consciousness, of neurons and networks, of sleep and dreams, of altered states and animal minds, of development and disorder, of philosophical theories and artificial minds, there's more to discover, more quiet facts about the mystery of subjective experience. But if sleep has found you, if consciousness has dimmed, faded, dissolved into the unknown darkness that comes each night, then rest knowing these questions will remain waiting when you awaken. While you sleep, consciousness withdraws though brain activity continues, processing memories, regulating physiology, cycling through stages each with distinct patterns, and perhaps distinct experiences you won't remember. Your sense of continuous self, maintained through waking hours despite constant change in thought and perception, has released its grip, allowing fragmentation that would seem pathological while awake, but is normal in sleep. Dreams may arise, generated by neural activity that creates experiences untethered from external reality, following their own logic that accepts impossibilities, reflects concerns and memories in transformed ways, and occasionally reaches lucid awareness where the dreaming mind recognizes its state. Time, which seems to flow continuously when conscious, collapses in sleep, with hours passing in subjective instants, illustrating how profoundly consciousness shapes temporal experience. The self you'll identify as you when you awaken may differ subtly from the self that fell asleep, updated by nocturnal processing, yet will feel continuous through memory linking present to past despite the unconscious gap between. This continuity is partly construction, not absolute. The narrative self is assembled moment by moment, with memories constantly revised, forgotten events filling in through inference, creating coherence where gaps exist. Consciousness, this phenomenon we use to understand everything else yet struggle to understand itself, continues its operation somewhere, in other minds reading these words, in animals experiencing their worlds through alien senses and cognitions, in patients trapped in bodies that won't respond, in practitioners exploring its varieties through disciplined practice, in infants whose conscious experiences are developing but remain inaccessible to us, in the gradual awakening from sleep or anesthesia as neural systems restart and awareness returns. The fact that consciousness exists, that there is something it is like to be rather than all being darkness, remains perhaps the deepest mystery, the hardest problem, the most wondrous aspect of reality. Science has revealed much: the neural correlates, the necessary structures, the sufficient conditions for various conscious states, the mechanisms of attention and perception and memory that consciousness employs, the gradual development through childhood, the fragility revealed by brain damage, the alterations produced by practices and substances. Yet the fundamental question remains: why does any of this feel like anything? Why is there subjective experience rather than mere information processing in the dark? This explanatory gap between objective description and subjective experience may narrow as understanding deepens, or it may represent a permanent limit on scientific explanation, or the question itself may transform as concepts evolve. The philosophical theories attempt to bridge this gap, proposing various relationships between mind and matter, but none has achieved consensus, and debates continue about whether consciousness will ultimately be explained physically, whether it requires new physics, whether it's an illusion to be eliminated, or whether it's fundamental to reality. These debates aren't merely academic, but touch on deep questions about human nature, our place in the universe, and what kinds of entities deserve moral consideration. The prospect of machine consciousness adds another dimension, forcing us to consider whether consciousness could exist in radically different forms, whether it's tied to biology or could arise in silicon, whether we should seek to create it or avoid creating it, and how we would know if we had succeeded. These questions will become increasingly urgent as AI capabilities expand, requiring decisions about machine status and treatment before we fully understand consciousness. Regardless, consciousness continues, its nature unchanged by our uncertainty about its explanation. You are conscious now, or were before sleep came, reading, thinking, feeling, experiencing from your unique perspective. This immediate fact, undeniable and intimate, is both the starting point for all inquiry and the most mysterious phenomenon inquiry encounters. Understanding consciousness scientifically while respecting its subjective character remains one of the great challenges, perhaps the great challenge, for science and philosophy. Each conscious moment is unique and ephemeral, arising from billions of neurons firing in patterns shaped by evolution, development, learning, current sensory input, and the ongoing stream of thought and feeling that constitutes your mental life. that these patterns give rise to subjective experience, that physical processes in brains produce the felt quality of being you, is the miracle at the heart of consciousness, the phenomenon that seems simultaneously the most obvious. Of course, experience exists, I'm having it now, and the most inexplicable, how could mere matter produce experience? The exploration of consciousness reveals how much we don't understand about ourselves, how the most intimate aspect of existence remains largely mysterious despite millennia of philosophy and centuries of science. Yet the exploration also reveals how much we've learned, the intricate neural mechanisms, the varieties of conscious experience, the development and disorders, the alterations and enhancements. Each discovery deepens the mystery while solving pieces of it, creating the productive tension driving consciousness research forward. The next time you notice you're conscious, aware of thoughts, perceptions, feelings, consider what an extraordinary thing this is, this inner light of awareness that makes you more than mere mechanism, that creates meaning and value and suffering and joy. Consider how little we understand it despite living in it always, despite its being the most immediate fact of existence, and how much there is yet to discover about this most intimate yet enigmatic aspect of being. Consider, too, that your consciousness is one instance of potentially billions or trillions of conscious experiences occurring simultaneously across the planet, in other humans with their unique perspectives, in animals seeing and hearing and feeling worlds we can barely imagine, perhaps even in systems we haven't recognized as conscious. Each consciousness is a universe unto itself, experiencing reality from a unique perspective that dies with the death of that consciousness, making each conscious being irreplaceable, each conscious experience precious. See you next time.